cloud. Excellent. I think we're ready to go. Good to thank everybody for coming. We have a bunch of panelists today who are going to talk about the differences that we've been seeing in our current situation to traditional pandemic fiction. And the first thing I want to do is have everybody on the panel introduce themselves. So I will start. I'm going to moderate this panel. I'm Charlotte Lewis Brown. I am a geologist and a paleontologist. I actually teach a natural disasters class at Green River Community Colleges. So pandemics falls right in that alley, although it's usually a little bit more subtle start than, say, a volcano or an earthquake. I'm also the author of a bunch of children's books on dinosaurs. Ricky, you're next on my screen. Why don't you take it away?
Oh, hi. Dr. Ricky is my nom de internet, and I am a working molecular biologist and microbiologist, but I love to teach using food. So, and I will pass it on to the next person.
Tom, you're next, I think.
Okay, Tom Whitmore. Used to own a science fiction bookstore called The Other Change of Hobbit, have a degree in zoology from Berkeley, and I work as a massage therapist these days. I've got some particular thoughts about some of the major differences between fictional pandemics and what we're dealing with right now. So we'll get into those in a moment or two. This is just introduction time.
Tracy.
Hey, I'm Tracy Ferratani. I teach physics at North Seattle College, and my experience is I'm living through a pandemic right now.
Jake, take it away.
Jake McKenzie, high school science teacher, pretty much every topic there is at one point in time or another. Right now teaching astronomy and introductory chemistry.
I'll say just a little bit more from Tracy, who was short in his introduction. You have also taught pretty much every science there is, including biochemistry, and have a long history and interaction with science fiction.
Yeah,
Tracy,
so we want to talk about that. Yeah.
Yeah.
I try to keep that secret.
Tom, since you mentioned you have some thoughts, do you want to start us off?
One of the things that strikes me as really different with plagues in books and now is how much more quickly things happen in books. There's 2 or 3 pages generally to get yourself to a place where almost everyone is dying. The other thing that happens a lot in plagues in books is far more than 1% of the people who catch it die. What we see is 80–90% of the population gone. You look at Earth Abides, where it's something like 95% gone, while one person is asleep for a month, mind you, but still basically asleep. And we don't see that level of loss in the pandemics that we're running across these days. Not even the 1918 flu, where it was a few percent. But to put this in perspective, if 1% of the people, if the entire population caught the coronavirus, the SARS-CoV-2 virus, and 1% of them died, that would still be less than the number of people we're replacing per year. The growth rate of humanity is about 1.2% per year, in the most recent figures I've seen. And so we're not likely to see any real reduction in human population from this. There's going to be an awful lot of loss. There's going to be an awful lot of hurt. There's going to be an awful lot of people being really upset. But on a population level, it's not that big.
I got a question for you. Talking about looking at that idea, though.
Let's see, Jake, you're just a little bit faint on my end.
Okay, maybe I need to turn it up a little bit. Turn my feet up a little bit.
Get closer.
Is that better?
That's better, a little bit.
Okay, I had it down for gaming last night. But think about it this way, Tom. You're talking about a 70 million, roughly. Is that about 70 million people dying from coronavirus? But even that would be on top of all the other people that die normally in a given year. I mean, yeah, you're right. It's never. I mean, the Stand. What? There's a couple thousand people left over.
Yeah.
In the United States, and it's always very fast, like you said. I mean, to my knowledge, Ricky, is there any virus that is that fast that kills that quickly?
You mean like in the Stand? Probably not. Because there's, like, for example, something like Ebola is pretty fast. But there are a couple of factors that are kind of weird about fiction. First, that they don't talk about transmission rates, right? It just seems to just appear everywhere all at once. But that could be because of it's logarithmic growth, and it just kicks off. I can get that. But also, there are two concepts. One is the phenotype is one or nothing, right? So you talk about 1% people dying, but we don't talk about how many % of people are deathly ill, need to be hospitalized, and there's this wide range of phenotypes that happen, all the way from no symptoms to mild, and in our case, sometimes mild can still be pretty brutal, and all the way down. So yeah, you might say, we'll replace the 1% in just pure population, but the impact of sometimes, like, if somebody's dead, the story ends. Like, okay, you can pick up and move on. But if they're debilitating, you've got a whole lifetime of changes. That complicates things. So that, again, doesn't get described in stories because stories need to be simple. And the third thing is penetrance, right? How far does it penetrate in the population? So yeah, most pandemic descriptions in fiction, to make it simple, it's 100% penetrant, and it's binary phenotype, alive or dead. If you aren't dead, you're healthy and you're a character.
Yeah.
Actually, there's another phenotype which is undead, like a zombie.
Oh, there's that too.
Just a word about that is it's kind of this magic button that has for a long time been used in fiction of all types, science fiction, fantasy, but just general historical, what have you. You want something to change. You want a totally new society. One thing you can do is like, oh, I'll hit the virus button. And they don't really talk about, as we have mentioned, one, the realities of it, but also the fact that even after the illness, if you're around, you may have a lot of challenges to overcome and a long-term recovery. So I think we give poetic license to that, but not dwell too much on what everybody got wrong. But then the question is, if we somehow some in the middle, how do you
well, I'm kind
see
of
the
hoping,
connections?
I'm kind of hoping that seeing this pandemic, and if writers do the research and look at the 1918 flu pandemic, that there's so much drama in human stories that can happen without using the nuclear option all the time.
Yeah. I'm going to actually pull up the screen again with the books, because one of the books that I had really wanted to talk about was Doomsday Book by Connie Willis. And this is a writer who I would say in some cases almost infamous for doing her research and really loving the research. And this particular book has two plagues in it. One is a modern plague. This is set in the future for the folks who haven't read it, where there's time travel. People go back to the past to gather information. And our heroine was set to go back to a town. Her plan was arrive right before the plague struck, with the idea that way it wouldn't really matter. I'm simplifying, but it wouldn't really matter too much if she accidentally let something slip or change things, because everybody in the town was going to die. And because of challenges in the future where somebody has accidentally reactivated an old virus bug by digging in an archaeological site, which I think is unfair to archaeological sites, but that's the vector. Everybody gets sick in the future. She winds up stuck in the past and has to live through the plague. And the reason I mentioned this book is it's really about how the humans, mostly in the past, deal with the fact that there's this unknown illness coming in. How do people react? So it's one of the few books I've read that actually looks at the human character interaction. And I was talking about this actually before we even talked about it on this panel with some folks. And I said, yeah, she got some things right about how people reacted, except it's, much more optimistic. And she said, what? The plague is more optimistic? I'm like, yes. People behave much better in her book. She doesn't capture a lot of the frustrating political blindness and some of the, I'm trying to be hesitant here because I don't want to be too judgmental, but we have people who are just saying on all levels of society things to blame their neighbors instead of actually dealing with the crisis. And that often gets into fiction, sort of packaged cardboard bad guys, but there's a whole variety and range of ways people react other than with charity and compassion and logic.
Well, is there a possibility, just think about this for a second. Ricky, we've all mentioned the fact that it's the nuclear button. You push the virus button and everything gets wiped in fiction. And then is it possible that this might be a trained, we've kind of been fed that, The Walking Dead, all these, Andromeda Strain, Contagion, all these movies that show everybody's either dead and dying or healthy. Is it possible that society has been inundated, at least in the United States, with this idea? And so they look around themselves, and it takes, for a lot of people, 2 or 3 steps to find somebody that's been actually affected by this. And it makes it surreal to them, and it makes it not real in a personal way. And so they do get, like you're saying, Charlotte, more angry at people that are scared or are nervous.
Because we've been trained in fiction to think it's either all or nothing.
Right.
So just, yeah.
Why is everything not falling apart? Why aren't there hundreds of people laying dead in the streets?
If it were real, why isn't? And then if they
when
don't,
our kids,
see.
When our kids
are actually dangerous.
Yeah. Well, when our kids are taught about the plague and talk about the plague in the Middle Ages in school, they talk about the body count. They talk about the people laying dead. Monty Python, bring out your dead. We've been taught that by our surroundings that a true virus, a true pandemic is going to level most of the population.
Yeah, well, that's looking at the tail end of the logarithmic growth, right? So this is sort of like the funny thing. Everything is built on top of this long chain of transmission. And what's funny is that fiction rarely talks about the chain of transmission. There's relatively few. I think
Stephen King did in The Stand. There are a couple of others. But yeah, The Stand right up here is a good example.
Like, I would love fiction writers to explain the concept of R0, like the transmissibility, and what the difference is between an R0 of 1.8 and 2 is huge, right? I mean, that's the difference between infecting 700 people and 10,000 people.
Right. But that's not really that exciting to explain from the point of view of the characters in a book, though. That's the real problem, right? I mean, just the slight change in slope, you're right, is a huge difference. But trying to make that compelling for the reader, that's a different trick.
Well, I agree. That's what Stephen King actually had to do with his. How many people here have read the unedited version of The Stand? In that, he actually goes into R0. He actually goes into the transmission rates and how one person interacts with 20 that are infected, that then interact with 200, that interact with, and he talks about the scale, but it's in the chapters that he was not allowed to put in the original book, which is what most people have written or read.
So he blamed the editors.
Yes. It's another
Well,
350 pages.
the editors have a good reason that most people aren't going to sit there and enjoy it. Actually, the best example for talking about something like R0 is Dickens, of all people, talking about an income of 1,999 pounds, 12 shillings, or 6 shillings, outgo 2,000 pounds, despair. Income 1,000, 2,000 pounds, 6 shillings, outcome of 2,000 pounds. Perfect. You know, and to a great extent, the question of whether you're infecting more people than one with each infected person is the question of whether the disease is going to spread or not.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's just a difference in the exponential rate of how quickly you get to everybody being infected if you're at 1.1 rather than 0.98.
Well, let me ask you. So I mentioned the Doomsday book. Is there, and we've been talking about The Stand, Andromeda Strain certainly has some of the science, so that's mostly a horror novel. Are there things that stand out, one or two books or short stories where people do what you thought was a good job of capturing some aspect, or some other books, I should say?
Well, everybody captures some aspects well.
What stands out to you?
Most of them capture the despair of the people who are left moderately well. You know, people continue keeping on because they tend to. Certainly, The Stand does a really good job, even better in the unedited version, of showing how exponential growth happens in a scenario of contagion. Most of the others, the Andromeda Strain is an exception, look at the end after the plague. Doomsday Book is much less panicked about the plagues that are spreading and the plagues are more realistic than most of the books. But that's what I noticed, sort of.
I think also that the expertise of the author comes into play too. This book, nobody knows this one anymore. It's from the late 70s, called Plague Ship. It's written by Frank G. Slaughter, who was like a mass market paperback writer at the time. And he's a physician, or he was a physician. And so the descriptions of how people catch the particular plague that he has, and again, he unfairly implicates archaeologists in discovering this virus, right? Okay. But anyway, the point is that he describes how it transmits to the first world and then basically the rest of the world. And the descriptions of how people are suffering and how the hospitals are overwhelmed are actually pretty amazing. And that probably does directly come from his experience as an emergency room physician. So it does really reflect what the author's lived experience is.
I was researching a little bit, trying to figure out what people are reading. Are they people actually reading pandemic fiction right now? And there are some definitely uptakes, like sales of some books have tripled. Others who are in print right now, most of them are seeing like at least a 25% increase in sales, because I think people are looking for a way to process. And in some of these stories, even if they're incomplete, there has been some thought set to how do we process what's happening around us.
Or it's just escapism too, right? Even as weird as that might sound. I mean, it's a different world where obviously the rules are quite a bit different, especially if you read something like The Stand. So yeah, I mean, there's wanting to process, but there's also just wanting to see something different.
Yeah, go ahead.
Here's one question I've gotten. Ricky and I were talking about this, and I think we got sidetracked a while back. One of the things that I see in the stories, and I believe Outbreak used this piece, was the idea of airborne. Because my wife was asking me just the other day, she was watching a show, one of those millions of medical, dramas, and they actually had an episode that was done in late February where they mentioned, well, we're lucky that this virus isn't airborne like Corona 19. What? So when they're saying airborne, because they use that a lot in the science fiction stuff of a virus going airborne, the risk of it going airborne, what does that actually mean? Because they say when you cough, okay, it's in the air. What does it mean by being airborne?
I think fictionally, they just mean it's some way of transmitting it without actually needing to be that close to the next person. And the truth is, like, as you're learning now, fomites are probably the biggest. Fomites are any other surface that humans come in contact with. So in all likelihood, you don't have like like measles. The person can be in the room, breathe a little, leave, you come back the next day and you can catch it. Right?
So that would sound like airborne to me.
Except that's not really
necessarily
airborne. That's fomites. That's contaminating the environment.
So if you come in the room the next day and you don't touch anything.
No, it might still settle on you, or if you touch something.
I think
that's
disturb
how
air.
infection, huh?
You disturb air, you disturb space, you disturb things.
There's a difference.
Wait, before we go on, I think it's important to say for anybody who hasn't seen the studies that measles is at one end of the spectrum of being contagious, and corona is not. I saw one thing, I don't know if you know this, Ricky, that like in an airport, this is why we worry about measles. It can travel like 100 feet, whereas coronas is more like 6 feet.
No, that's just measuring. Those are usually tests that are like aerosol based, like how quickly. There are two factors to it. One is particles travel pretty far, but the question is how long can the viral payload remain viable? And measles remains viable for a long period of time.
And one of the differences.
So go on, Tom.
One of the differences is between something that is aerosolized and something that is in droplets. The droplets will tend to drop out of the air fairly quickly. The aerosolized particles are much smaller, and they tend to remain airborne a lot longer because of Brownian motion. They also tend not to get too close to somebody's skin because they follow, the aerosolized droplets follow the laminar flow of air around people. We have a little tiny barrier of air that it's hard for things to get through. You have to be moving fairly quickly.
Or breathing in.
But it doesn't have to be that, right? Like, for example, HIV is a pandemic, right? AIDS is a pandemic.
It's very difficult to transmit, though.
It's definitely not airborne. It's very specific fluid-to-fluid transfer, and it's very contagious. In context, but I think like it sounds scarier in a fictional context to say just it's airborne. You suddenly all you have to do is just be near somebody and they can unwittingly transmit it to you.
What's the difference between the flea-borne and the airborne forms of bubonic/pneumonic plague? The pneumonic form is a lot easier to catch.
The mnemonic form, I remember. I'm kidding. Nobody got that joke.
That was terrible.
The question of a PN or an MN.
You're welcome. Did anyone read the White Plague by Frank Herbert?
Oh yeah, good book.
Okay, that's a kind of a hilarious, bizarro version of what we're going through right now.
Yep.
I've noticed that number one, as written, it was artificially created. This one is not. The fictional virus kills women preferentially to men. The COVID-19 kills men preferentially to women. I think almost 2-to-1 ratio. And and it's the white plague as opposed to. Well, let's not even go there because the disparity of people perishing from COVID-19 is very stark. But oddly prophetic if you flip every factor involved.
And then you have the question of whether diseases have positive effects. You look at Camp Concentration by Tom Dish, where there is a disease which is basically sexually transmitted, which, aside from killing people, also makes them significantly more intelligent.
Significantly more intelligent.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Huh.
And there can be all sorts of effects from diseases.
There
Yeah.
was
Also, you look at polio and post-polio syndrome, or where people appear
there-
fine for a long time, or with
wasn't there a suggestion a while back talking about trying to figure out why the human brain developed the way it did? There was I can't remember the research on it, but there was a research suggestion that possibly a reaction to a viral infection could have caused a chain in the human brain.
No, I can't be. That's the viral infection causes the human brain to be delicious.
it causes us to love cats.
That too.
But there's also the whole question of, are eukaryotic cells an infection of prokaryotic cells?
No.
Oh, really?
Well, no.
Wait a minute.
There is some sense that the chloroplasts, the mitochondria, et cetera, which have their own DNA, are descendants of prokaryotic cells that invaded.
We kind of knew that.
For a long time, that wasn't known.
They're not invaded. It's a symbiotic relationship, because the nuclear genes descended from a different prokaryotic line. So you can think of eukaryotic cells as having the fusion of two prokaryotic lines.
Well, wait a minute. So we're talking about the fact that the organelles within the cell of complex life, like plants and animals, actually have DNA similar to, and in some cases identical to, bacteria that live out in the environment. Mm-hmm. I thought that there was, at least at one time, a suggestion that viruses had been involved. Although it sounds like, Ricky, what you're saying is that you think everybody got together mutually. I thought it was maybe even a failed case of digestion in some cases. I mean, it's happened more than once, but
I don't think that's it's we can never reconstruct that history as to whether that was because you're
never say never,
because you're imposing a kind of intent to it, like one is trying to eat the other. But phagocytosis, that entire process, presupposes that you already have a eukaryotic cell to begin with. So, but what we do know is that if you can divide, so there's two problems. Like, so the one that studies more.
We don't want to get too far into the medic.
I can go deep into the lectures into this.
Yeah.
But there are mitochondria, just mitochondria alone. The different major branches of eukaryotic life have very different kinds of mitochondria. But our education is heavily skewed towards mammalian mitochondria because I don't know, maybe there's some kind of bias involved, but the diversity of mitochondrial forms out there is enormous.
Well, but this riffs, lets me remind something that I had wanted to say as I started through that there. There is a theme that I've come across in multiple authors where the virus is, at least to the survivors, beneficial. So Tom, you say, we can have stories where you get increased intelligence, or whoever said that. But there's also, where it gives you more strength or more werewolf characteristics. I'm not making that up.
More of a chance to survive, which is what evolution of, survival of the fittest is about. It's just.
Yes. But wait, what I was going to say is a lot of these stories, they have the virus actually modify people's behavior in ways that parasites do. So there's a mix-up of viruses, which are fairly simple packets of DNA that come over and take over your cells. and some of the very complex things that parasites can do, which, mentioned can be associated with increased risk taking, or for some parasites that have multiple hosts, they will cause animals to insects to crawl up on top of grass, so they're more likely to be eaten by the bird, which is the next phase. And viruses and bacteria and parasites tend to all be melded together. But there is, I think, a fascination in this idea that something can invade your body and, for better or often worse, actually take over.
Go on, Jake. Oh, was that Tracy?
Wherever I am. Yeah, no, I just wanted to mention that it's a topic that, in fact, Dr. Ricky, you actually mentioned last week about how, organisms can alter other organisms' behavior for their own ends. And
Yep.
I think certainly, the one that really freaks me out is prions. So basically, yeah, the idea of proteins being able to teach other proteins how to fold. And I don't know if anybody's seen a very good science fiction treatment of that idea, but I haven't. I would be really interested in.
Cat's Cradle.
Cat's Cradle.
That's about water.
Oh, wait. I'm good.
Cat's Cradle is about a different morphing of water so that it becomes solid at room temperature. And that's exactly what prions do. They change the protein shape, and they change the way that the protein folds. In Cat's Cradle, it's just the water being changed.
But it doesn't have it doesn't have a biological effect on behavior, for instance, right? I mean,
no.
It's physical properties.
Other than killing people.
Yeah, of course.
Prions are like, if somebody can go a deep dive into the discovery and the description of prions, it would make a great story, because there's so much we don't know. Number one, it's very biophysical. You're right. It's all about protein conformation and stacking and like crystallization. There are prion forms that work in yeast, and you can cross species. The gene that encodes the prion protein can be deleted and causes no harm. So why is it still around? It's like there's like all sorts of questions like that, and a science fiction writer would have a ball with this. I for one thing, like watch for example, a prion, since it's not actually any DNA, and it's not even really the protein, it's just the shape of the protein, isn't species specific. Mad cow. That's why mad cow can affect humans. Right? But that means that you shouldn't eat anything with any kind of spinal tissue, like fish, or. But we do it anyway. And why would it go from the stomach to your central spinal cord? If somebody can go a deep dive in that, great story material.
But I haven't seen one yet.
Yeah, no, I haven't seen one yet. I mean, like, just explaining the concept of it can drive some people nuts. It's hard enough to explain to people, for example, that coronavirus has no DNA components at all. It's a completely RNA-based protein, RNA-based virus. And even among some virologists, it blows their mind.
Yeah.
Isn't that the way with all the cold viruses, though? Aren't they all RNA viruses?
All the cold virus. Well, the cold is a disease.
Well, but I mean, because the confusion is that this is just a variation of the common cold.
No. The common cold. So the common cold is the disease, but there are multiple viruses that can cause the same symptoms.
Okay.
So it's not really one disease in that sense. But some of the common cold symptoms can be due to coronaviruses. And yes, you're right. Coronaviruses as a family don't use DNA. They're really fascinating organisms. I'm due to give a lecture on it sometime this week.
Does that make them more contagious than something that's not an RNA virus?
Fictionally, you can make anything as contagious.
Well, I'm just blaming this all on midi-chlorians.
Oh,
sorry.
You said people gonna die? Yeah.
If you're
You
gonna
know,
go silly plagues, there's a book again from the late 70s. That was my phase for doing this sort of thing. It's called Deadly Messiah by a guy by the name of Hill. And in that one, astrology is implicated in the virus.
Yes.
So it's pretty awesome.
So the one thing that's really silly about this, like after we're going through this pandemic, is I just realized that Thanos is terrible at his strategy.
yes.
Like why would you
But-
snap your fingers and kill 50% of the population right away? If you start with logarithmic growth and you seed it and you just let it go, you know, like it would snap your fingers, nothing would happen. Everyone would go like, "Oh, you're not such a bad guy after all. You can go off." You know, 4 months
If he
later,
wants to survive, he could have been a bit more subtle.
yeah, 4 months later, half the population will be dead, and you're free and clear.
Wasn't me. I'm
It
not
wasn't me. I
responsible.
wasn't there.
But you know, that's a really boring 4 months of the movie when you're just waiting for people to figure it out.
No, that's great, because then you like flash forward 4 months later, and why are people suddenly pooping and disappearing, like in increasing numbers?
But we're actually coming up, I think, on about 40 minutes where we've been doing this.
Mhm.
And it looks to me like there's 1 or 2 people who have something from the chat.
Mhm.
Karen, I had turned off that link. Do you have anything for us? If you could unmute. And
You can unmute Karen directly, right? Okay.
I have a
Yeah.
question from Sherry. You can unmute her. You can let me read it.
um,
Question for the panel to consider. Trends in subject matter for science fiction novels ebb and flow over the years. But has anyone observed if viruses' main plot trends popular in any positive or negative relation to viral outbreaks in reality?
I like that.
Only
will
with
say-
zombies.
Well, wait a minute. I will say one thing, that after the Spanish flu, for a couple of decades, there were a lot of fictional accounts and semi-fictional accounts of what people did and how to react. Some of them including a sort of an uptick, as I understand it, an uptick in fiction about the bubonic plague as people tried to process, I think. I don't know, has anybody, besides zombie plagues, I think actually, because zombies fiction has been on the rise for a while.
Right.
Anybody
Zombie
have
fiction
any
follows
thoughts?
a different social set of things going on. I haven't
Yes.
noticed any particular increase in viruses. Viruses are usually a means rather than an end kind of thing.
Well, but why has zombie fiction been on the rise?
Uh,
And will it now crash after the next couple of years, or will it take off?
Well, think about The Walking Dead. The Walking Dead has become a family drama. It's a family drama of interactions of living humans. It's not, the zombies are a side note now.
Yeah.
And I mean, if you think about it, you're right. Tom, I think you just said the virus is the means to the end. It's the means to make the story happen and make the story different. Look at The Strain, where the virus causes vampirism. The virus isn't the issue anymore. It's the
It's not even a virus.
that's not a virus, that's a parasite.
parasite. Is it a parasite? I can't remember.
It is.
I
It's
haven't read
like
it for a while.
worms.
Well,
It's
there
no
are
worms.
books where viruses cause vampirism, like Iona Andrews' whole series. The vampires are sort of mindless beasts, but that is a pathogen that's a virus. But you were saying, Jake.
Well, it's just, I mean, I don't know if there's going to be there'll probably be an uptick, but
I'm asking
Again-
you guys to go out on a limb.
well, but I think one of the problems is, like you're saying, nobody wants to read about normal people being stuck inside, not being able to go out in the sunshine because they're on lockdown because there's a 2% death rate. They're going to have to, it's going to be expanded into something that's,
Oh, I don't know. That's pretty much what Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix is. Like, all the kids are in lockdown, and all you hear is stories of the things going on outside. In a sense, it's great drama. because you can't do anything. You can only get secondhand information. It's great writing.
I
To some
think that's
extent,
a
Naked
real
Sun by
possibility.
Asimov is about that too, where you have a culture where people never meet each other. But to go back to what are zombies about? Zombies are about the dehumanization of people by absolutely soul-sucking jobs. We're afraid that we're going to be turned into something that has no will of our own and that just goes around doing whatever we need to do to get brains.
And look what happens when we're pushed out of those soul-sucking jobs.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if
No,
it's
not
better
right
or
now.
worse yet.
We don't know yet. We don't know what the social results of this are going to be.
I'm just waiting for people to sparkle.
No.
Some people already do.
I think it's a filter on the web camera.
You spoil all my fun.
My
But
job.
I think you're right about the things coming in phases. Though, is that I think it's not so much that there's a particular trigger in terms of current events, so much as there's a trigger of that studio's producing that movie. We'd better make one of our own. So as I recall, things like Hot Zone, Contagion, and Outbreak kind of came like relatively quickly, one after another, and so I'm guessing that basically. There was a phase where we had asteroids hitting Earth movies for a while and things like that. Well, I'm guessing that, that's the same thing that happens with these disease movies and possibly books.
I could see that. I actually, the first couple of weeks was looking for something that was way different, but I had trouble actually reading some of the books. I get electronic books from the library, so it's that was easier for me to get, but I've also been getting books shipped in from bookstores, and it's just so disconnected from what we're going through today that I actually started turning to some of the zombie fiction, which I don't usually read at all, but at least it was way far out there, but at least it was talking about people whose situations sucked. In some ways that had an overlap. And so I wasn't constantly saying, these people don't know how good they have it, or whatever. I mean, actually, a lot of people in the zombie books didn't really know how good they had it either, but so it was an interesting evolution. I've gone sort of back to reading everything now, but out of curiosity, what are people reading or, recent movies that you've seen? We're going to end this in just a few minutes, but maybe end it on a high note, some recommendation for folks. Tracy.
Oh, well, in addition to the couple that I mentioned, another one that came to mind as, actually pass, I forgot the name, go.
Well, I'll go. We have a family movie night, and I wound up watching Howl's Moving Castle last night. Fine movie, but it's also a fine book. So we were fighting this morning over who got to read Howl's Moving Castle.
I've been doing a lot of rereading, but more I've been watching a fair amount of anime. And
yes,
if you want to see something fun about microbes, Moyashiman is this marvelous thing about a kid who can actually see microbes and ends up in an agricultural college in Tokyo, and it's very sweet.
What does he get from seeing microbes?
He sees them, he talks to them, he plucks them out of the air, and he can tell when somebody's about to eat something that's going to cause terrible food poisoning and stops people from doing that. But mostly he's a teenager trying to figure out what's going to happen with his life. He has this weird quirk, and it's very sweet.
And
it also talks about fermented foods, and it teaches an awful lot about how fermentation works in all kinds of ways. And
I love that about
it has
Japanese
some of the smelliest food in the world.
Ricky, you were saying? We didn't quite catch that.
Anime. I was a big fan of Yakitate, which is an entire Japanese anime about baking bread. Mm-hmm. And they stage these grandiose battles over baking bread. It's hilarious.
Sounds reasonable.
So I've been reading a lot of real science because that's what I do for work. So in whatever free time between, I'm sort of starting to watch this new movie called Code 8, which is sort of I'm only in the first 30 minutes of it, but it's kind of formulaic, a population that has 4% mutant powers and they're being oppressed, and it's sort of a great way to put good-looking white people pretending to be day laborers. So that's as far as I've gotten so far. I'll let you know what I find out about it. I've heard a couple of good things about it.
Jake, can we put you on the spot?
Sure. One of the things that's been interesting and been a real discussion topic is what is normal going to look like a year from now, 5 years from now, whatever. And I think one to dig out that might be worth reading, it's not a long novel, is THX 1138.
Mhm.
Because basically in that society, they don't really tell you the reasons why, but they've become this isolated society where everything, literally everything, is isolation. And human interaction is frowned upon in all ways. So as a dynamic of what could this become, as the joke goes, how quickly we've gone from God bless you to fuck off when somebody decides to sneeze.
Hey, wait a minute, we were supposed to keep this clean.
Oh, sorry, my bad.
You get it in the edit.
Yeah, you can say God.
Yeah, now I have to learn how to edit.
I'm teaching you.
Yeah, I'd make a hand gesture, but I can't.
Oh, well.
It's off camera.
I can make mine on camera because I don't have camera. Woo, I win. But, you think about it, how differently everybody's reacting. I mean, before the shutdown even happened, my daughter's friends, when they cough or sneeze, they had people react weird around them. It's like, how does that dynamic play in as we move forward would be an interesting concept to watch.
Yeah, Jake, in fact, if I can build off of that, I remembered the title of the book I was thinking. I thought it was called Aurora, but it's not. That's the name of the planet. Isaac Asimov has a book called Robots of Dawn, in which basically the society is set up so that they are in complete social isolation. It's the norm.
That was originally in The Naked Sun back in the 50s.
Right.
Of Asimov's. So same world.
Same world.
I mentioned it earlier.
Oh, sorry.
Jake, do you know the author of the book you were mentioning?
Yeah, Ben Bova, B-O-V-A. He also wrote Colony and a bunch of other solar system stuff over the 80s and 90s. He's kind of gone crazy in the 2000s. But
he was also the editor of Analog for a while. So,
yeah, he was.
Yeah, he's quite well known in the field.
I've been seeing the chat button flashing on and off with some information about the books, but perhaps some other things. Karen, do we have any other questions, or anybody else, if you'd want to raise your hand or put something in the chat?
Over in the chat, THX 1138 was actually George Lucas's first film. Bova wrote the novelization of it, rather than it being something that he originally came up with.
Okay.
So it's definitely Lucas's thought.
We have a note from Bayan Pol, which says The Cells at Work. I'm not sure if that's a film or a book, but that's a title that Bayan sent in.
Maybe anime series, I see.
Okay.
Ah, yes.
Yes.
Excellent.
There's also a much more lighthearted book called Life on Man, which is about all the things that live on people's skin.
No, thank you.
It's a pretty good book. You know, we wouldn't be here if not for some of those things.
No, that's why I tell people that literally no one can be a vegan, because every breath you take, you eat animals.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a question of how you define animal.
Yeah.
No, that's pretty easy.
And defining animal is not as easy as you think.
And that could be a whole nother discussion.
That's a whole other topic.
Karen, did you start to say something there?
This is a little bit out of my chat purview, but I wanted to say that on editorial conversations right now. All the short story editors are having a fit because people are sending them not just pandemic stories, but really bad ones.
Yeah.
And, however, there is one publisher who is doing an anthology called Going Viral. And what they want in there is a look at what if quarantine stays? We are looking for near future science fiction, exploring comedy, horror, and human drama of a life spent 6 feet away from each other.
Wait, that's fiction? That's real.
Well, they want to know what happens if we have to stay in quarantine for a very long period of time. What will life be like?
The fiction is projecting into the future, Ricky.
Yes.
This, you know.
And again, it's called the Going Viral Anthology.
If people really stay 6 feet apart, we're going to have maybe one more generation.
At that.
At best.
Well, it depends on, never mind.
Yes.
We really won't go there.
Please.
Speaking of
Maybe, maybe on that note, I am going to end the recording this time around. We'll have folks stay around for just a little while, but I am going to wave goodbye and have everybody else wave goodbye. And thank everybody else for joining us.